Judah, true horror story. She came back from the dead, but she wasn't a lone night whisperer. The village of Long and had always harbored its share of mysteries, but none quite like the tale of Mrs. Tuesday. Her story began in tragedy and ended in terror, a supernatural nightmare that would haunt the memories of those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Two lived alone in a small wooden house at the edge of the village, a structure that seemed to sag under the weight of loneliness and time. At 80-something years old, she was a relic of a bygone era, her weathered face telling stories of loss that few could comprehend. Her husband and only son had both perished in the war decades earlier, leaving her with nothing but the hollow echo of memories and the charity of distant relatives. The old woman had adopted two nieces, Tam Na and Lillian, daughters of her deceased sister. But as fate would have it, once they married and moved away, Mrs. Two found herself abandoned once again. The girls visited occasionally, bringing rice and small amounts of money, but their presence was fleeting, a brief respite from the crushing solitude that defined her existence. Every day followed the same dreary pattern. Mrs. Two would wake in her creaking bed, prepare her meager breakfast, and then make her way to the local gambling den where she and 3 other elderly women would play cards until evening. It was her only source of joy, the only thing that kept the demons of loneliness at bay. The government pension she received as a war widow, combined with the sporadic assistance from her nieces, was barely enough to sustain her simple lifestyle. Her house sat precariously on land that belonged to another neighbor, Ba 3, whose own wife had passed away years earlier. The arrangement was informal, based on old family connections and rural courtesy, but it meant that Mrs. Two lived always on borrowed ground, both literally and figuratively. On that fateful afternoon, when the other elderly women arrived for their daily card game, they found Mrs. Two's door locked and no response to their calls. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, they peered inside and gasped in horror. Mrs. Two lay motionless on her bed, blood trickling from her nose, ears, and mouth, dried and darkened, suggesting she had been in this state for hours. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community. Neighbors rushed to break down the door, finding the old woman unconscious but still breathing faintly. They carried her to the local clinic, but it was too late. By evening, Mrs. Two had passed away on the journey home, her frail body finally succumbing to whatever mysterious ailment had befallen her. The traditional rituals began immediately. A fortune teller was consulted, who decreed that the burial ceremony should commence at 5 a.m. the following morning. The funeral preparations were modest but respectful, with her nieces Tam Na and Lillian arriving to oversee the arrangements. Incense burned, prayers were offered, and the community gathered to pay their final respects to the lonely old woman who had lived among them. As dawn approached on the day of the burial, Tam Na sat vigil beside Mrs. Two's body, preparing for the final viewing before the coffin would be sealed forever. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and the acrid smell of incense when the impossible happened. "She's moving," Tam Na screamed, her voice piercing the morning stillness like a knife through silk. The gathered mourners initially dismissed her cries as the hallucinations of grief, but as they approached the body, they too witnessed the miraculous and terrifying truth. Mrs. Two's cold, stiff fingers began to twitch. Her skin, which had been ice cold and pale as marble, began to warm. Color returned to her cheeks, and most shocking of all, they could detect the faint but unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat. Within moments, Mrs. Two's eyes fluttered open. She sat up slowly, stretching as if awakening from a particularly deep sleep. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the shocked faces of her nieces and the elaborate funeral preparations. "When did you two arrive?" she asked casually, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Who let you in?" Her eyes fell upon the ceremonial items, the incense burners, and the funeral decorations. "What's all this? Why are there funeral preparations in my house?" "That's very unlucky." When the stunned witnesses explained what had transpired, that she had been dead for nearly 15 hours, Mrs. Two laughed dismissively. "Dead? When was I dead? I was just visiting with your Uncle Tuesday. He invited me to go for a walk, and I was only gone for a little while. Why would you say I was dead?" Among the witnesses was Tam's father, a man who had heard many stories of supernatural occurrences throughout his lifetime. He observed Mrs. Two carefully, looking for signs that might indicate whether this was truly her or something else inhabiting her body. A fear rooted in local folklore about spirits possessing the recently deceased. But Mrs. Two seemed completely normal. She recognized everyone, remembered their names and relationships, and answered questions about her past with perfect accuracy. There were none of the telltale signs of spiritual possession, no ravenous hunger, no confusion, no speaking in strange voices or exhibiting abnormal behavior. When offered food, she politely declined, asking only for water. The community elders agreed that this appeared to be a genuine resurrection rather than a supernatural possession. What had begun as a day of mourning transformed into a celebration of miraculous return. The funeral preparations were hastily converted into a feast of Thanksgiving, and neighbors gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Following the resurrection, Tam Na and Lillian realized they could no longer leave Mrs. Two alone. The trauma of nearly losing her, combined with her advanced age, made it clear that she needed constant supervision. Since both women had their own families and responsibilities, they decided to hire a live-in caretaker. The first woman to accept the position was Mrs. Bay, a widow from the village who needed the income to support her young daughter. The job seemed simple enough: cook meals, clean the small house, wash clothes, and provide companionship for the elderly woman. Mrs. Bay would bring her daughter along, and they would sleep in the front room while Mrs. Two occupied the back bedroom. For exactly 1 month, Mrs. Bay performed her duties without complaint. Then, abruptly, she announced her resignation, claiming she had found better-paying work elsewhere. Her explanation seemed reasonable, and no one questioned it at the time. The second caretaker was Twee, a 16-year-old girl from a large, impoverished family in the village. She was mature for her age and needed the money to help support her parents and siblings. The arrangement was identical: care for Mrs. Two during the day, sleep there at night, and maintain the household. But Twee lasted only 5 days. On her final night in Mrs. Two's house, Twee was awakened by what would haunt her dreams for years to come. She had been sleeping peacefully in the front room when she sensed a presence looming over her. Opening her eyes, she saw a dark silhouette standing beside her sleeping mat, illuminated by the flickering oil lamp that burned throughout the night. It was Mrs. Two, but not as Twee had ever seen her before. The old woman's face was transformed by shadows and lamplight into something grotesque and menacing. Her eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity as she stared down at the frightened girl. "I couldn't sleep," Mrs. Two whispered, her voice carrying a strange, hollow quality. "I was checking to see if you were comfortable, if you could sleep well in a strange place." Twee's heart pounded as she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm fine, Mrs. Tuesday. Please go back to your room and rest." But this was only the beginning. Each subsequent night brought new horrors. The second night, Mrs. Two claimed to be hungry and wanted Twee to cook for her in the middle of the night. The third night, Twee was awakened by strange scraping sounds coming from the kitchen. She found Mrs. Two eating directly from the rice pot with her bare hands, scooping the food with animalistic hunger while making disturbing slurping noises. The fourth night was worse still. Mrs. Two began singing, if it could be called singing. The sound that emerged from her throat was unlike anything human, a haunting melody filled with words about death, graves, blood, and decay. The lyrics spoke of things that should never be sung about, especially not by an elderly woman in the dead of night. When Twee investigated, she found Mrs. Two sitting in the darkness, her face twisted into an unnatural smile, her eyes rolled back so far that only the whites were visible. On the fifth and final night, Twee experienced the most terrifying encounter of all. She was sleeping when she felt something sharp scratching against her back. Turning over, she let out a scream that pierced the night air like a siren. Mrs. Two was lying beside her in the sleeping area, but her appearance was monstrous. Her fingernails had grown into long, razor-sharp claws, and her teeth had elongated into pointed fangs that gleamed in the lamplight. For just a moment, Twee saw her transformed into something that was definitely not human. But in the blink of an eye, Mrs. Two's appearance returned to normal, leaving Twee to wonder if she had imagined the entire horrific vision. "I was afraid you might be scared of ghosts sleeping alone," Mrs. Two said with apparent concern. "So I came to sleep beside you for comfort." Twee, trembling with fear and barely able to speak, managed to stammer, "Please go back to your own room. I'm not afraid." I prefer to sleep alone." The next morning, Twee packed her belongings and fled to Tam Na's house, refusing to spend another moment in Mrs. Tu's presence. She recounted every detail of her 5 nights of terror, her voice shaking as she described the supernatural encounters. Initially, Tam Na tried to convince Twee to continue working during the day only, without the overnight stays. Reluctantly, Twee agreed to this arrangement, thinking that daylight might provide safety from whatever dark force had taken hold of Mrs. Tu. But even this compromise proved impossible. On the very first night that Twee slept at her own home, she was awakened by violent pounding on her family's door. Her uncle opened it to find Mrs. Tu standing there, her face contorted with rage and her eyes blazing with an inhuman fury. "Where is Twee?" Mrs. Tu demanded, her voice no longer that of a frail elderly woman, but something powerful and threatening. "Why didn't she come to sleep with me tonight?" Twee's uncle explained the new arrangement, but Mrs. Tu would have none of it. "She must come back. I cannot sleep without her there. She belongs with me." The transformation in Mrs. Tu's physical presence was as shocking as her words. Gone was the slow, shuffling gait of an elderly woman. Instead, she moved with the swift, purposeful movements of someone decades younger. Her entire demeanor radiated a strength and vitality that seemed impossible for someone of her advanced age. When Twee's uncle firmly refused to wake the girl, Mrs. Tu's anger reached a crescendo. "Fine, then she need never come back at all," she spat, before turning and walking away with that same unnaturally quick stride. After Twee's terrifying experiences became known throughout the village, Mrs. Bay finally revealed the truth about her own month with Mrs. Tuesday. Her resignation had nothing to do with better employment elsewhere. She too had experienced supernatural encounters that had driven her to the edge of sanity. Mrs. Bay confessed that she had been too frightened to speak out earlier, fearing that people would think she was fabricating stories. But Twee's similar experiences validated her own terrifying memories. One of the most disturbing incidents Mrs. Bay recalled involved the coffin that had been purchased for Mrs. Tu's funeral. Since the resurrection had made it unnecessary, the coffin was stored in the back room, covered with a sheet, waiting to be returned to the funeral home. On several nights, Mrs. Bay had performed her routine check on Mrs. Tu, only to find the old woman's bed empty. After searching the house frantically, she would discover Mrs. Tu lying inside the coffin, her face pale as death, her eyes closed as if she were truly deceased. When Mrs. Tu would suddenly open her eyes and smile, that same ghastly, inhuman smile that Twee had described, Mrs. Bay would nearly faint from terror. "I'm cold," Mrs. Tu would explain matter-of-factly. "The coffin is warmer than my bed." Another night, Mrs. Bay awoke to find Mrs. Tu holding her young daughter's hand, saliva dripping from the old woman's mouth as she stared at the child's fingers with what appeared to be hunger. When confronted, Mrs. Tu claimed she was merely protecting the child from mosquitoes, but the predatory look in her eyes suggested something far more sinister. Word of these supernatural encounters spread throughout Long and like wildfire. The village that had once celebrated Mrs. Tu's miraculous resurrection now lived in fear of what she had become. No one else volunteered to serve as her caretaker, and people began to avoid her house altogether. Even the elderly women who had once gathered for daily card games stopped visiting. They spoke in hushed whispers about how Mrs. Tu would appear at their windows in the middle of the night, tapping on the glass with those unnaturally long fingernails, her face pressed against the pane with that horrifying smile. Children were forbidden from playing near her house. Pets that wandered too close to her property were found the next morning in various states of distress, some missing patches of fur, others bearing small puncture wounds that no one could explain. The local spiritual advisor was consulted, a man versed in the ancient beliefs about death and resurrection. His conclusion was both simple and terrifying. Mrs. Tu had indeed returned from the dead, but something else had come back with her. Whether it was a malevolent spirit that had attached itself to her during her brief journey to the afterlife, or whether the resurrection process itself had corrupted her soul, no one could say for certain. As months passed, the supernatural activities surrounding Mrs. Tu only intensified. Neighbors reported seeing her walking through the village at all hours of the night, moving with that same unnatural speed and agility. She would peer into windows, stand motionless in people's yards, and emit that haunting, inhuman singing that had so terrified Twee. Some villagers claimed to have seen her in multiple places simultaneously, an impossibility that added to the growing legend of her supernatural nature. Others reported that their livestock would become agitated and refuse to eat after Mrs. Two had been seen in the vicinity. The most disturbing reports came from those brave enough to venture near her house after dark. They described seeing lights moving about inside when no electricity had been connected, and shadows dancing on the walls that seemed to have no earthly source. The sound of that otherworldly singing would drift from the house on windless nights, carrying lyrics about death and decay that chilled listeners to their very souls. Tam Na and Lian found themselves in an impossible situation. They could not abandon their adopted mother, but they could not bear to be near her either. Their visits became increasingly rare and brief, conducted only during daylight hours and never alone. As time went on, Mrs. Two's transformation became more complete and more visible. Her physical changes were no longer limited to brief, frightening glimpses. Her fingernails grew continuously and had to be trimmed daily, yet they always returned to their claw-like length by the next morning. Her teeth, once worn and yellowed with age, became sharp and white, more suited to a predator than an elderly human being. Her diet changed as well. The simple rice and vegetables that had sustained her for decades no longer satisfied her. Neighbors began to notice that small animals in the area were disappearing. First chickens, then cats, and eventually even dogs. No remains were ever found, leading to speculation about what Mrs. Two might be consuming in the privacy of her isolated home. The most chilling change was in her eyes. Once kind and somewhat dim with age, they now glowed with an inner light that seemed to pierce through darkness itself. Those unfortunate enough to make eye contact with her reported feeling as though she could see directly into their souls, reading their deepest fears and darkest secrets. Her voice, too, had altered. While she could still speak normally when she chose to, there were times when her words carried harmonics that no human throat should be able to produce. Children who heard her speak would burst into tears, and adults would find themselves filled with an inexplicable dread that lasted for days. Years have passed since Mrs. Two's resurrection, and the village of Long and has never been quite the same. The house where she lived stands empty now. Some say she simply vanished one night, while others claim she still occupies it, invisible to human eyes but very much present. New families who move to the village are warned about the property, though few believe the stories until they experience something unexplainable themselves. The local children have created rhymes and games about Mrs. Two, turning her into a boogeyman figure used to frighten each other on dark nights. But for those who witnessed her transformation firsthand, Tam Na, Lian, Tui, Mrs. Bay, and the others, the memory remains vivid and terrifying. They know that death is not always final, that sometimes what returns from beyond the grave is not what was lost, but something else entirely. The story of Mrs. Two serves as a reminder that some miracles come with a price, and that resurrection might not always be the blessing it appears to be. In Long Inn, they say that on particularly dark nights, when the wind is still and the air is heavy with moisture, you can still hear her singing those terrible songs about death and decay, reminding the living that the boundary between life and death is far thinner than we dare to imagine. The horror of Mrs. Two's return lies not just in what she became, but in the terrible knowledge that she had once been loved, cared for, and mourned. A reminder that evil can wear the face of someone we trust, and that the most frightening monsters are often those who were once human. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire ordeal was the question that haunted everyone involved. If Mrs. Two could return from death so fundamentally changed, what does that say about the nature of death itself, and what awaits all of us on the other side of that final threshold? The village of Long and has learned to live with these questions, but the answers remain as mysterious and terrifying as the night Mrs. Two opened her eyes and sat up in her coffin, forever changed by her journey to the realm of the dead. 3 years after Mrs. Two's disappearance, a folklore researcher named Dr. Min arrived in Long Inn, drawn by rumors of the supernatural events that had plagued the village. A professor of anthropology from the university in Ho Chi Minh City, he specialized in documenting rural legends and unexplained phenomena throughout Vietnam. Dr. Min was a skeptical man by nature, approaching each case with scientific methodology and rational analysis. He had debunked dozens of supposed ghost stories, always finding logical explanations for what locals attributed to supernatural causes. But the consistency of the testimonies from Long and intrigued him. Too many witnesses, too many corroborating details, and too many unexplained physical evidence. He rented a room in the village center and began conducting interviews with anyone willing to discuss Mrs. Tuesday. Most villagers were reluctant to speak openly about their experiences, but gradually, Dr. Min pieced together a comprehensive account of the events. Tui, now 19 and married with a child of her own, agreed to meet with him only after much persuasion. She had moved to a neighboring province shortly after her ordeal, unable to remain in Long and where the memories haunted her daily life. "You don't understand," she told Dr. Min during their interview. "I've tried to convince myself it was imagination, stress, or fear playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. That woman, that thing, it wasn't human anymore." Dr. Min pressed for details, taking careful notes as Tui recounted her experiences. What struck him most was the physical evidence she described. The elongated fingernails, the transformed teeth, the unnatural agility in someone supposedly over 80 years old. "Have you experienced any lasting effects from your time there?" he asked. Tui's expression darkened. "I still have nightmares. But worse than that, sometimes I feel like she's watching me, even now. I'll be alone in my house, and I'll suddenly feel this presence, this cold that settles in my bones. I'll turn around expecting to see her standing there with that horrible smile." Dr. Min's investigation took a disturbing turn when he decided to examine Mrs. Tu's abandoned house. The current owner, Ba 3's widow, had been trying to sell the property for years but found no buyers. Local superstition had made it essentially worthless. Armed with a flashlight and camera, Dr. Min entered the house during daylight hours. The structure was in a state of decay. Roof tiles had fallen, walls were stained with moisture, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the interior. But what he found in the back room made his scientific skepticism waver. Scratches covered the wooden walls, gouged deep into the timber as if made by claws rather than human fingernails. The scratches formed no recognizable pattern, but their depth and width suggested an inhuman strength. Some reached nearly to the ceiling, far higher than an elderly woman should have been able to reach. In the corner where Mrs. Tu's bed had once stood, Dr. Min discovered dark stains that had soaked into the floorboards. Chemical analysis would later reveal these to be blood, but blood that contained cellular structures unlike anything in medical literature. Cells that appeared to be in various stages of decay and regeneration simultaneously. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of small bones buried beneath the floorboards. Initially, Dr. Min assumed they were animal remains, perhaps from Mrs. Tu's changed dietary habits. But closer examination revealed something far more unsettling. The bones showed signs of having been gnawed by human teeth, with bite marks that matched the dental impressions he had reconstructed from witness testimonies. Dr. Min's rational worldview received its greatest challenge on his 7th night in Longan. He had been working late in his rented room, transcribing interview notes, when he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. The haunting melody that multiple witnesses had described, Mrs. Tu's otherworldly singing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that carried impossible harmonics floating through the night air. Dr. Min grabbed his recording equipment and rushed outside, determined to document this phenomenon. The village was eerily quiet except for that haunting song. Following the sound, Dr. Min found himself drawn toward Mrs. Tu's abandoned house. As he approached, the singing grew louder, more complex, as if multiple voices were joining in a chorus of the damned. Standing in the overgrown yard, Dr. Min saw her. Mrs. Tu stood in the doorway of her former home, but she was not the frail, elderly woman described in the testimonies. This figure radiated a dark vitality, her hair flowing in a wind that Dr. Min could not feel. Her eyes glowed with that same unnatural light witnesses had described, and when she smiled, her teeth gleamed like polished bone in the moonlight. "You've been asking questions about me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance despite speaking in barely more than a whisper. Looking for answers where there are none to be found. Dr. Min's hands trembled as he tried to operate his recording equipment, but the devices had mysteriously malfunctioned. His camera showed only static, and his audio recorder produced nothing but a high-pitched whine. Some doors should never be opened, Mrs. Two continued, taking a step toward him. Some deaths should never be reversed. I learned that lesson, but perhaps I learned it too late. As she moved closer, Dr. Min could see the full extent of her transformation. Her fingernails had indeed grown into claws, and her teeth were sharp as razors. But most disturbing was her skin, which seemed to shift and crawl as if something moved beneath the surface. "You want to understand what I am," she said, now only a few meters away. "But understanding comes with a price. Are you prepared to pay it?" Dr. Min found his voice enough to stammer. "What happened to you? What did you become?" Mrs. Two's laugh was like breaking glass. "I died, Professor. I went to the place where all souls go when the body fails. But I was pulled back, dragged back by the grief and need of those who loved me. The problem is, when you return from that place, you don't come back alone. There are things that live in the spaces between life and death," Mrs. Two continued, circling Dr. Min like a predator stalking prey. "Ancient things that hunger for the warmth of living flesh, the taste of beating hearts. When the boundary is broken, when someone returns from beyond, these things can slip through the cracks." Dr. Min struggled to process what he was hearing, his academic mind fighting against the impossible reality before him. "You're saying something else came back with you?" "Not with me," Mrs. Two corrected, her voice taking on a dual tone as if two people spoke simultaneously. "Inside me. It needed a vessel, a body that had already died but could still function in the world of the living. I was perfect, already dead, but restored to life through the love and need of my family." The revelation hit Dr. Min like a physical blow. Mrs. Two wasn't possessed by an evil spirit. She was a host to something far worse, something that had used her resurrection as a gateway into the living world. "The hunger started small," she continued, "a craving for raw meat, for the taste of blood. But it grew stronger, more demanding. Eventually, it required more than animal flesh could provide." Dr. Min's mind raced to the missing persons reports he had researched during his stay. Over the past 3 years, 7 people had vanished from Long Un and the surrounding villages, all during the night, all without a trace. "You killed them," he whispered. "I fed," Mrs. Two replied simply. "The thing inside me must eat, and I am merely its instrument. But I retain enough of my original self to feel the horror of what I've become. That's my punishment, to be aware, to remember who I was, while being unable to stop what I do." Mrs. Two's confession continued in the darkness of that terrible night. She revealed that the missing people had not been random victims. The entity inside her was selective, drawn to those with strong life force, those who burned brightest with vitality and hope. "It prefers the young," she said, her voice filled with a grief that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. "Children especially, but young adults work as well. Their life energy is more potent, more satisfying to the hunger that drives me." Dr. Min realized with growing horror that he himself fit the profile, a young academic, full of curiosity and life, far from home with no one expecting his immediate return. "But tonight," Mrs. Two said, stopping directly in front of him, "I'm going to do something different. I'm going to give you a choice that I never had." She extended one clawed hand toward him. "You can run. Leave this village. Never return. Never speak of what you've learned here. Live your life knowing that I continue to exist, continue to feed, but safe in the knowledge that you escaped. Or," Dr. Min managed to ask, "or you can stay and help me end this. I've learned enough about the entity inside me to know that it can be stopped, but only through a specific ritual, one that requires the willing sacrifice of someone with knowledge of the supernatural world." The choice she offered was impossible: flee and live with the knowledge that others would die, or sacrifice himself to stop a monster that had once been a lonely old woman seeking companionship.